Hello, and welcome to the Inside Writing Podcast. I am your host, Josh Sippie. As a reminder, all of these episodes are recorded live Wednesdays, 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. You can sign up on the Gotham Writers website for free. Now then, on to the show. Today, we are talking with American-based baritone Ryan McKinny. McKinny has performed at such places as the Metropolitan Opera House in New York City, Bayreuth, and many more. He has earned his reputation as an artist with something to say and believes the power of art lies in its relevance, that genuine connection can wake up a stagnant society to the possibilities of change. With Helio Arts, he commissions artists to write, direct, and film original stories, leveraging his personal power to help elevate voices and visions in the classical performing arts world. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Hey, Josh, thanks so much for having me.
Of course, thanks for being here. So, as always, as we always do on the show, the first question I want to ask you is to sort of explore that breaking in point, the moment that you felt like you'd really sort of arrived as a creative, like you knew you were here, you were doing what you wanted to do. Was there a moment for you, like an aha moment of like, yeah, this is where I'm supposed to be?
I mean, gosh, I get that question pretty often. And it's, to me, the answer is sort of, I'm constantly having that moment. I feel, I think probably like most creative people, I have my bouts of imposter syndrome, and then all of a sudden I'll be somewhere doing something really cool and be like, wow, this is really happening. But, I would say probably like the first time I sang at the Metropolitan Opera, then, as a filmmaker, the first time that I made something that, people watched publicly, that was pretty cool. And, but it kind of happens on a regular basis for me, actually.
So then a follow-up there is, and again, this is something that I love to ask because I like the diversity of the answers. Was there a time where you realized you were talented? Like with creative, as you mentioned, there are a lot of moments where we doubt ourselves. When did you feel like, you really were something?
Gosh, there's a lot to unpack with that. So I am a person who, strangely, I don't really believe in the concept of talent. I kind of feel like the way I think of talent as a concept is like, it's a way to explain what people can do when we don't understand what that is. And I think that, human beings are pretty freaking miraculous. And that's just literally across the board. So, talent, I think, in the sense of like in this particular field of being able to sing opera, when I was a teenager, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I was a really bad student, had a lot of troubles, in life, and went to a community college and kind of tried singing as a, easy A sort of thing, and had a couple of really great teachers who said, it wasn't obvious that I was going to be like a professional opera singer, but they were like, you kind of have a voice, maybe be something you'd be into. And I just kind of fell in love with it. And I realized it was something I thought I could get good at. I wasn't good at it yet, but I thought I could get there. And, going to Juilliard, I think maybe was the first big moment of like, oh, this is really like something people would care about. But even with singing, everyone's born making sounds that are connected to their emotions. And that's really all that singing is. And the kind of singing I do is a cultivated sort of thing that's kind of like narrowing the focus of what I'm trying to get across. But it's certainly not that some people have voices and some don't. Even, people will tell me I can't sing, I'm tone deaf or whatever. And I think, for the most part, what that's about is people that haven't been exposed to it or for enough time, or as a child weren't, singing regularly. Or sometimes even what'll happen is people with really great ears will hear more pitches than a normal person and not be able to pick out which one to sing. So that's kind of my spiel on talent, which is it's controversial amongst my friends and family.
I like it though. I want to rewind there because it's a big leap to go from a high schooler who was trying it out to being in Juilliard. Like those are extremes. So what, at what point was it like an immediate click? Like, oh, this is what I'm going to do. I imagine there were some moments where you, deviated or thought maybe I could do something else. What happened along the way?
Yeah, I actually wanted to maybe be a composer for a little while. I was in a lot of choirs when I was I went to Pasadena City College after high school, and had some great teachers there. And just as I got into it, and I had a couple of I did a scenes program singing, the Figaro and the Marriage of Figaro, which is now a thing I've done a lot as a professional, and was like, oh, this is, I love the way that you can, when you hear a great opera singer, the way that that emotion is in the voice so viscerally, it's something you almost really can't get through a recording. When you're in real space with someone and like, it's just their voice, the air and your body, and you're connected to them. I was just blown away by that. And I thought if I could do that, I would really love it. And so it was the first thing I really dedicated myself to ever in my life. And I spent 2 years at Pasadena City College and then 1 year at Cal State Northridge, kind of really trying to get it going. And then thought, I think this is the time to move to New York. Let's just see what happens. I auditioned for Juilliard and I got in and kind of went from there.
Awesome. So, I mean, it sounds like in that sort of retelling, everything sort of went according to plan. Like this was something you wanted to have happen. You pursued it. You went to New York. You went to Juilliard. I imagine there were some snags in the road, though. What were some obstacles you ran into? Moments maybe where you even considered quitting?
Oh, for sure. And then, I think probably a lot of writers will understand that the urge to quit keeps happening over and over, even when you're a professional, right? Because it's hard to expose yourself in that way as an artist to, really try to put yourself out there. When I was at Cal State Northridge, for example, a lot of my teachers said, you're not going to make it as a professional singer. You shouldn't go to New York, blah, blah, blah. And then even at Juilliard, I didn't get a lot of roles. I was not one of the top singers in my class. I wasn't accepted in the Juilliard Opera Center, which was a sort of more prestigious program. But, I think for better or worse, kind of something about me that has helped me is that I just don't give up very easily. And so I kind of just kept plugging away. When I got older, I have a wife and 2 kids who travel with me all the time, which is awesome. We can talk more about that too, but it's also super stressful. And, when you've been doing it now 20 years for me almost, that gets to, it takes a toll and you try to figure out what your priorities are and all that. So there's certainly like it ebbs and flows with the, oh my gosh, I'm so successful. And oh my gosh, how am I going to do this? This is, scary.
Yeah. And I want to get back to the traveling component here in a bit, but I want to revisit because it's amazing to me how often I hear people say they had a college teacher professor said, you're not going to be able to do this. And how many people don't take that. Like, was that a challenge for you? Did you hear that and think, oh, I'm going to prove them wrong? Or did you maybe think maybe I can't do it?
Yeah, I definitely used it as motivation. I think that it's hard to say. I think they meant the best for me. I think they were genuinely thinking, there are so few people that make it in that area, right? It's like, even the people I went to Juilliard with, just a couple of us from my class are still singing professionally. And that's not because the other people weren't great. It's just, there's not a lot of spots and it's a really hard thing to do, especially consistently. But I just was sort of hard-headed about it. And I feel like I've been really mostly lucky that I've had great mentors who I listened to and took their advice to heart, but then also made my own choice after I took in that information. And I think that's kind of a pattern I've had that's served me pretty well. Because, in the end, you're the only person that can make choices for you. And you're the person that knows yourself the best. And so I don't know why now I'm like, that kid was so stupid. Why did he do that? But I'm happy he was that stupid and just did it anyway.
That's great. And one of the reasons I asked is because, the part in your bio that always gets me is you've earned a reputation as an artist with something to say. And I'm wondering when that sort of picked up, because, when you mentioned you weren't top of your class, you were having these things, what was it they sort of kept your creative drive going? Did you know that you had something to give to this creative world, or was it just strictly hard-headedness?
I think I had an inkling in that I did feel, as a young person who was not very connected to my community and not always very connected to my family, who had a hard time with that, the connection that I felt with an audience or as an audience listening to a singer kind of would heal me in these little ways. And at first that was really just about me. And I think that's true for a lot of artists when they're starting out, it's you're filling a need where you for whatever reason need that connection with your audience, with your colleagues, and all that. I remember I was pretty young still. This was probably 18 years ago, 17 years ago. I might be having these dates wrong. I had the pleasure to sing in Oedipus Rex with the Los Angeles Philharmonic, and a really great conductor named Esa-Pekka Salonen, who was the music director there. It was his final performances as music director. And the director of the show was a guy named Peter Sellers, who, if you've heard of Peter Sellers, the director, not the actor, he's this kind of fireball of a human. He's short and has this like crazy hair and wears these beads and hugs everybody. And I remember meeting him for the first time, was like, you are insane. And I have no idea like how I'm going to make it through this process. I was just like, this guy is totally full of it. Can we curse on this podcast, or should I keep it to myself?
Go for it.
He was very full of shit. I was like, this is ridiculous. But then I got to know him. And in this process, like, I realized he always, every single show that he worked on, he thought that it could say something really important to the audience. It was never about him or whether it was good, quote unquote. It was always about delivering this message. And he would not let me get away with just skating by on stage and worrying about whether I sounded good and whether the critics were going to be nice to me. And he really forced me to think about, what do I want to say with this? And it was this kind of moment for me. I remember standing on stage at Disney Hall and like really thinking it's very important that the audience understand what I'm trying to do right now. And it just stuck with me. And over time, especially working with Peter, because all of his pieces have some, way of trying to reach people where they are today, some relevance in our society, and sometimes in a way that makes people mad. It's not always a gentle way of doing it, but he really inspired me, and it kind of, has stuck with me all these years.
And since we're on the subject of, that kind of formative thing, I want to ask you about your sort of creative process. Like, whenever you see a character, especially because, we're mostly writers here, like I was saying before the show, and our job is to create a character. That's essentially it. And your job is like the next step, bring that character to life. So when you see this character on the page, on the script, what is your sort of process to become that character?
Yeah. I'll tangent for just a second to say to all the writers out there, I have a lot of writers in my family. So my wife is a screenwriter on some of the films we've made and is currently working on screenplay. My stepmom teaches screenwriting at North Carolina School of the Arts. My great grandfather wrote books and screenplays for Disney. He wrote Follow Me, Boys, and Big Red, if you've ever heard of those. I actually, because I knew I was going to be here, he had this little shack in the back of his house and had these like little sandpaper things to file his pencil. And he had these like huge notebooks full of screenplays. Anyway, that was a cool anecdote. But my process really comes from trying to treat characters as if they are full human beings and not judge them myself. That's kind of the basis of it, especially from the acting part of it. There's a lot of, musical things that I have to deal with too, and technical vocal things. But from a character perspective, which really informs everything else for me, I really try to figure out that person and not get stuck on the things that are scary. So for example, there's an opera version of the book and film Dead Man Walking. And I did the role of Desrochers, who's the main character on Death Row, when we did Chicago Lyric Opera a couple of years ago. And it's a really, really brutal person to live inside. And it's very easy to judge. The very first scene is he rapes this woman and kills her. Like, it happens on stage. And it's very easy to not let yourself be in the part of his mind that does that and just say he's evil and that's fine. I don't have to know about him. But I find that there are much more interesting choices made if you don't assume that you could never do that yourself, And I find that's true in relationships too, and with people. For example, when I started studying for that role, became friends with a man on death row in Texas named Terrence. And he and I've visited him several times now, and we've written for several years. And he's about my age, and he has a daughter that's my daughter's age. And he grew up in a really, really bad part of Houston. And it's easy for me to say I would never kill anybody, but I've never had to experience his life. And I try to think that way about my characters, especially the ones that are bad, which is a lot of the people that I play. Because I think it actually the badness of them comes across more real to an audience if it feels motivated by actual human situations and emotions. But B, then you also have the potential for, which I think is like why art's awesome, for people to empathize with that character and find that character in themselves, and then hopefully go out in the world and see other people as more connected to themselves, which I think if particularly music does anything really well, it's that. And so that's sort of my way in to those things.
And what do you look for in the writing to help inform your character choices? Like, are you looking at, like what they just as physical description, looking at the way they speak? What kind of things go into the way you form these characters?
Yeah, for sure. All of those things. I often will find, I love about writers and composers who are very similar. They're writers, they're just writing in a different language. They're writing in music instead of text. I love finding the things that writers subconsciously put in there where they didn't think about what it meant. A little phrase here and there or something that just came out and they didn't think about it, but then it can say a lot about who that person is. And it's true for music too. Sometimes you'll hear a certain harmony or something underneath a certain moment, and it just opens up that's what he feels right in this moment. That's what he's thinking about. And so I love sort of being a detective and searching for clues in the text. And it's not quite trying to figure out the writer's intention, because of course, if you're working with a living writer or composer, you can just ask them. But I find that most of the time they actually are not very good people to ask, because their ideas about their work is maybe not, what you need to hear as a person who's interpreting that work. But I love finding the things that seem like maybe they didn't mean to put it in there that point me in a direction.
And then last question about character. Has there ever been a role that you've struggled to get into, and what sort of caused that struggle? Or maybe not. Maybe it's always been sort of the same.
Yeah. Strangely enough, there have been a few. The one that comes to mind is his name is Escamillo in the opera Carmen. He's the bullfighter. I have a very hard time when there's a sort of expectation, especially in the opera world. There's these traditional roles that have this kind of, this is the way you do it. And it can be a lot of kind of outward performance of an idea of a character rather than like a fully fledged human. And the first several times I tried to do Escamillo, I just always felt like, I don't get him. Like, what is this thing? He just shows up and says how awesome he is and then sings a song and everyone loves him. And that really can work for some people, but that isn't really me. And so I had to figure out like, what's the version of that I could find in myself. And it sort of finally worked, but I did have a hard time with it. I don't know what it says about me, but I tend to have an easier time with like really screwed up characters that are like, have some kind of trauma or whatever. But often it's just because they're more fleshed out, the way they're written.
And then I know I said last thing about character, but I want to ask, how much do you bring yourself into the character? Or do you leave yourself completely out of it and you become this other character? Because I know like the whole difference between method acting and whatever. Do you bring yourself into the role or try not to?
I would say that I don't. My wife is, she was an actor when we met, and a very good one, and actually sort of was my acting teacher along the way. And I think she would say it's about what you're trying to make the other characters feel, or what you're trying to make the audience feel, and not to kind of get hung up on where that's coming from. So I would say that I certainly do put myself in characters, but not as a conscious effort. I'm the one up there, and the emotions that are happening are from me. And so I don't think there's any way to separate that, but I don't sort of like, envision my dead grandmother when I'm trying to be sad in a scene. I find that to be sort of, you can make yourself cry, but is it really connected to the story you're telling? I think usually not. But I don't try to actively keep myself out of it either.
I want to switch back to sort of your journey here. And one pit stop on the journey that I always ask creatives is that moment where they got an agent, because that always seems to be such a big vaulting point. So many of us see it like that's the end goal. But where were you as an artist when you got an agent? Were you like, was this still pretty early in the process, or were you long overdue?
Yeah. Well, let me put it this way. So to me, that's always the agent question. This is also true in our world with like a conductor who might give you a job, or a director who might want to hire you. To me, it's about building relationships over time. So when I was at Juilliard, I worked with this wonderful director named Frank Corsaro, and his agent was a woman named Elizabeth Crittenden, and Betsy. And Frank, I asked him, he sort of liked me and said, do you have an agent? And I said, no. And he said, why don't you meet Betsy? And I met Betsy, and Betsy said, you don't need an agent right now. She said, there's nothing to manage right now. Keep in touch. And I think, to my credit, I did keep in touch, and I sort of asked her advice every couple of months. Should I do this thing or that thing? What do you think about this? And over time, she sort of learned what I was about. And I don't think it was just, there are some singers, and maybe this is true for writers too, who what they do innately is so amazing that everyone, like, once they see that, just like throws everything at them. But that was not me. And I think for the most part, that's like, that only happens to the 0.000% of artists in any field. And so for me, it was always about like everything that I do, my singing, but also like how I make music, how I use text, me as an actor. I show up on time. I know my part when I arrive. I'm an easy colleague to work with, all of that kind of stuff. And so Betsy sort of like got me over time. And then a few years later, when I really was starting to look at getting real jobs, she said, okay, I think it's time. She didn't have room for me on her roster, but she set me up with her. So she sort of co-managed me with a younger manager who ended up being my manager for a long time. So yeah, I think to me that the way that works well, at least in my field, and I imagine this is similar in yours, is building relationships with people over time rather than just hoping to impress them with one moment.
And you mentioned when you were ready to start getting serious jobs, how did you know that it was time for you? Did you just feel like you as an artist had advanced far enough?
Yeah, in the opera world, there's a pretty clearly laid out path in terms of American singers, at least. So if you're starting somewhere like Juilliard, which is an amazing place to start, because you can talk about whether it's worth the tuition for the education you get. It's a good education, but you can get good education somewhere else. But if you have Juilliard on your resume, you can get someone to answer the phone or see you in an audition. So that starts you sort of in the door, at least. Then once you're done with the conservatory, you go to what they call a young artist program, which is sort of like an apprenticeship, where they pay you very little money, but you can kind of work as an understudy and do small roles in the house. And there's a couple of big ones in the United States. The Metropolitan Opera has one, Chicago Lyric Opera has one, San Francisco has one, Houston Grand Opera has one. And that's the one that I ended up at, which was great for me. It was a really high level of training, but also out of the way enough for me to be able to make mistakes without, the whole world seeing it. And it worked really well for me. So it was sort of, I knew that was once I was done with that apprenticeship, which is usually about 2 years, then I would start doing auditions for bigger roles as a guest artist in a lot of different companies. And that's really when, as a singer, you start to need a manager.
And throughout all this time, were you working side jobs, like things that had nothing to do with your artistry? Or were you doing like other ways to make money?
Yeah, I am very lucky. I'm very privileged. I mean, we can get into this, but so much of the reason I think that, people in the arts come from at least middle class or upper middle class or wealthy, mostly white families, is because it takes a lot of support to be able to learn that craft. And if you are working a full-time job at the same time, it's really hard to keep up at the same pace. And it's one of the reasons I, really care about the way in the opera world we handle racism, and also the way that music education is handled and things like that, because, some of my friends who are people of color who are amazing singers had to do so much more work to get where they are than I did. And having said all that, I'm very grateful that, my family, when I was at Juilliard, was able to take some loans for me and help me get through without having to take a job. When I got out of Juilliard, actually, my wife, Tanya, was working, and she basically supported us for several years. The Young Artist Program is enough to kind of barely pay the bills. But we also had our daughter Emma was born the first year I started my Young Artist Program. So it was pretty tight. But I was lucky enough to have, even if they didn't hand me money, my family, that just knowing in the background that if I failed, there would be people there to help me is an enormous benefit when you're trying to, learn this craft that's pretty insane to learn, and it takes a ton of hours. So yeah, I was really lucky.
That's awesome. And I want to get back to this probably later, but I want to make sure we save some time to talk about your, actually, because you brought it up before, I want to ask you about the travel component of the job, because, you've been New York, you've been Germany, you've been Washington, you've been all over the place. And you mentioned how that can be stressful. How does that affect, because you essentially have to plan to give away certain days just to travel. How does that affect your workload or your ability to match the workload?
Yeah. I mean, I suppose there's a universe in which, like, if I didn't have a family, we didn't travel together, I would be slightly more technically, quote unquote, successful. However, I would never want that life. It's so, I'm a whole human being who gets to like spend time with my family all the time, wherever we go. And that's amazing. And I think it makes me a much better artist, honestly. It's real crazy. There's really no blueprint for what we do. It's almost, the closest is probably like a military family. We have homeschooled our kids for now 16 years. We've traveled all over. We've been to Australia and Korea and Germany and London and New York and all over the United States and all over Europe. And in many ways, it's been amazing for all of us. We've had incredible experiences together. Our kids like understand the actual range of human beings across the world, and like how that really, they're all pretty much the same. On the other hand, it's really hard for them to have long-term relationships. It's easier now with technology, but it's still really difficult. It's hard for us to have a community, where we live. It's been interesting over the last few years with COVID, not traveling so much and sort of seeing what that would feel like. And we can get into that more, but it's definitely, it's been a wild ride, and we've sort of had to make it up as we go. But I wouldn't change it for anything. It's been really great.
And I do want to, because I'm glad you brought that up. I did want to touch on the COVID aspect of it, because we don't get to talk to performing artists very often. I mean, as writers, we were affected, but not in the sense that it got in the way of what we were trying to do. So how did that shift affect you, and how is it changing now, if it is?
Yeah, I mean, it was huge. So the way that opera singers are paid is a per performance contract. Usually, if you're a soloist, There are, if you're a member of a chorus, it's a little different, or you can be like a weekly artist at somewhere like the Metropolitan Opera, or in Europe, you have like a fest contract, which is sort of like you're a member of a company. But for the most part, singers that do what I do in the United States, it's per performance. If you don't sing, you don't get paid. And within the course of 2 or 3 weeks in March of 2020, all of my work for the next year was canceled. And because we travel together, and Tanya, my wife, essentially runs our business and also our lives in terms of travel and the kids and all that, she doesn't have a paying job. So it was scary there for a little while. And we were very lucky that one of the jobs I had that was canceled was with Houston Grand Opera, and they gave a percentage of the amount they would have given us. They went ahead and paid it to us. So it gave us a little bit of a buffer. But we immediately started these kind of little silly YouTube videos trying to raise money for artists that were out of work. It was called Keep the Music Going. And what started as very simple kind of iPhone videos of just like me singing, I would edit a piano track into it. Then it got to be where I would do it with my friends, and then we would like turn it into scenes that were sometimes funny. And it got to be pretty great. And having filmmakers in my family, I started to get the idea that, okay, if this is going to be a long-term situation, these companies aren't going to be able to produce live work for at least the next year. We knew that was going to be true. And so my wife and I together started making films for opera companies. And we've done a bunch of them now. And it's kind of started out small and has gotten pretty big in scale. And we both direct and write and operate cameras, and I edit and all of it. And it's been pretty crazy, but amazing. Also because I'm so used to being on the side of, directors and conductors and everyone and writers telling me what to do on stage, and I have to interpret that. And being the person that sort of comes up with the idea and helps try to tell people what I think they should do and let them run with it is a totally different experience, and really, really neat. So, it's totally shifted our lives, really. Now I'm going back to singing. I just sang Figaro at the Metropolitan Opera a couple months ago, but I'm still doing some of this film stuff, and it's a really interesting time. And I know this is true for a lot of my colleagues, where during the pandemic, they've sort of made their own way. And now they're juggling like the old world of just being a singer on the road and also all these new creative projects. And it can be overwhelming. So, but I'm really grateful. It's been a pretty incredible couple of years in terms of the creative process, for sure.
That's the perfect segue into what I was going to transition into before, which is Helio Arts, which is I believe what you were talking about, what you started during the pandemic. Could you tell us a little bit about sort of just bare bones what this is? What's the mission behind it? Yeah.
So in making some of these films for opera companies, we realized there wasn't, let me backtrack a little bit. Mm-hmm. There has been opera on film. Mostly it's been live capture, right? If you've seen like the Met in HD is a thing, you can go to a movie theater and watch a performance of the Metropolitan Opera in the movie theater. I don't love those for a lot of reasons. The biggest one is that I think a director and a team of artists are creating something on stage for the audience in the room to experience. And that connection between them is the most important connection. And when you're watching it from somewhere else, you're almost like a third party. It's kind of a documentation of a performance, but you don't really get to be the direct audience. Whereas when you're making a film, Martin Scorsese thinks of me watching the screen when he makes the movie, right? I'm his audience, and that all of the language of film is used to bring me into that story. And so we, from the beginning with the films we made, wanted to make films that were actual films with opera as the medium. So we used cinematic editing. We shot on location. It wasn't in a theater. Using all different kinds of techniques and storytelling. But we found that it was really hard to find somewhere for that piece to live, because a lot of the like, aggregating websites and things like that were for live capture pieces, of which there are a lot. And there wasn't really a spot for what we think of as cinematic arts content. And so some colleagues of mine, also my wife, Tanya, Lauren Meeker, who runs the Opera San Antonio, Alex Romano, is another former singer and friend of mine, started helioarts.com, which is this essentially kind of curated sort of Netflix for arts films, but it's very, very much things that are cinematic and not just putting a camera in a theater. Because we want to, I think that there is a huge future of mixing film and performing arts in a way that we haven't. You can see it right now with the way that, Lin-Manuel Miranda is doing all these amazing things. I think that the Broadway world has already understood that for a while now and is really getting great at it. And in the classical arts, we just sort of haven't quite taken that up yet. And so I'm just excited to, it's really experimental. We're trying a bunch of different things. Some things work well, some things don't. But it's really exciting to kind of be on the edge of a new thing.
And you mentioned how you're filling more of the parts now. You're operating camera, you're writing things, you're doing all kinds of different things for this. How has that process been as an artist? Because you'd always, it sounds like you were always, opera. This was sort of your lane. Now you're filling all these other lanes as well. How is that? Do you feel like you've grown as an artist as you've taken on these new roles?
Yeah, for sure. I've always been a pretty hardcore hobbyist. So anything I've taken up, I really kind of get obsessed with and learn everything about. That hasn't happened professionally since I first was getting interested in opera. And this was kind of this, I don't know, perfect storm of all of the elements. And I had always wanted to, actually had been pitching an opera film for a couple of years before COVID happened. And it just, at the time, people didn't need that kind of thing. And we needed to be able to make these things for a very little budget because everyone was on a budget crunch. But the technology now in the film world is amazing. You can get a cinema grade camera that shoots, 4K and looks, and is Netflix approved for, $5,000 or $6,000. And, the way you can edit it now is it's just, you couldn't think about doing that, what we did 10 years ago. And so I learned everything I could think to learn. I asked everyone I knew how to do it. I practiced ad nauseum and just kind of winged it when we didn't know what to do. Also because of some of the technical things that we were doing, no one had ever done before. We were having people sing live on camera instead of lip sync because it's such a more immediate performance. And then, so how do you, pipe in an orchestra sound into their ear and okay, well, you need an earpiece. Well, then you have to have the angle like this. And where can we cut it so that it makes sense, with the story and all of these things that there wasn't really a blueprint for. And in the process of that, sort of realizing that I was doing something I was really proud of that was totally separate from being a singer. In a lot of ways, it's been amazing to go back to singing and have a level of confidence in myself that it's not that I don't care what everyone thinks about me, but I have a lot more room for just being me. And it's okay if people are allowed their opinions about that. And so it's just been really freeing. Because I've spent so much time doing this other sort of crazy stuff. And I know that I could still do that. And there's just a kind of, the opera business can be really, really harsh. It can be, a lot of very high level singers have a hard time just in their day-to-day lives, handling the pressure, because it's just, it's an art form where it's a high wire act all the time. And so you can kind of get bogged down by that year after year. And I think I had really towards, when the pandemic started, was really feeling fatigued and a little burnt out. Even as my career was, from an objective standpoint, doing as well as it ever had these amazing roles happening, all of the coolest things I'd ever done were happening. But, on the inside, I was just exhausted and, burnt out. And so now I just feel a kind of freedom to go out and be me. And if that's enough, that's enough. And if it's not, that's fine. And yeah, it's great.
And I want to ask specifically, because you've been in some of these movies yourself, namely Sport, which looks amazing, and I really want to see it. But what was there? I mean, I feel like it's like a writer doing fiction versus nonfiction. It's the same thing, but it's not the same thing. So how was it for you being used to being on stage to being now behind a camera?
Yeah, I think there's certainly a lot to learn, and it's a very different process, but I use some of the same tools. As a singer, I really kind of visualize the path of a scene and visualize myself in space and how the story works. And it's a very similar process directing a film, because I'm literally watching the film in my mind before it exists and trying to figure out how to make that happen. And also another benefit is, working with singers, we were working with opera singers all the time who didn't really have on camera experience usually. And in a lot of high pressure situations, having someone as your director who knows what you're going through, who knows the physical limitations of what you're being asked, and how difficult it is, can really be helpful. So there was a lot of times where I felt like it was really helpful that I was a singer that these other singers knew and respected. And so if I asked them to do something, they knew that I wasn't doing that. Even if it was something I knew was really difficult, I understood what I was asking, that they could do it.
And then even looking at Heliowatts from a broader picture, where did the ideas for these films come from? Are they all coming from you, or do you sort of get them from different places?
No. So, and in fact, I'm not involved in making all of the things that are on Helio. I have been in most of them. But no, early on, the very first few things we did, I sort of came up with, and I sang in them, and I thought, okay, well, we'll just make a bunch of things where I'm singing in them. And then I quickly realized, like, there's only so much people want to see of Ryan McKinny on screen. And I know all of these other amazing artists who I know are not doing anything right now. So I called a bunch of my friends who I have, like, these really great friends who are, incredible opera singers. Jamie Barton is this freaking superstar, and she's also a buddy of mine. And early on, I was like, hey, I'm making these movies. Let's do something. What do you want to do? And she said, I love this opera Bon Appetit, which is, it's a 20-minute thing that is her playing Julia Child baking a cake in a kitchen. It's like from an episode of the Julia Child show. So she said that to me, and I went and pitched it to some companies and put together the logistics and figured out how to make it happen. And then we did it. And that kind of was the pattern over and over. Some of the things have been my idea, but more often it's been colleagues that I really want to work with, who I'll say, hey, I want to make something with you. What do you got, on your brain that would be awesome to make? And then we just try to make it happen.
So how do you know, for these, it sounds like you just knew someone that was talented and took their story and let them do it. How do you know when it fits? Like, are you trying to establish a brand with Helio Arts? Like, this is our kind of film, or is it just sort of a free form?
I would say that in terms of the aesthetic, it's really just about using the medium of sort of what you might call art film, or indie film, alongside opera, dance, spoken word, instrumental music. And other than that, the other big theme is really trying to feature voices that, don't often get featured in the classical music world. So, we did this really cool project called The Road We Came with a great bass baritone named Kenneth Overton. And it was this walking tour of Black history in New York. And it was like all these amazing, we got this historian, Eric K. Washington, to sort of curate these tours. And basically it was like people watched the film while they were in these places in Manhattan, and it's amazing stories about, Langston Hughes or whoever. And it was really cool because Kenny's this amazing singer, and so it sounded great, but it's also like connecting the history of this music and this culture in New York, which is such an important city for the arts and for Black history, And so just to have the opportunity to do that, where in a normal, opera house, it's like pulling teeth to get projects like that done. But in this little time where we could do anything we wanted, literally like almost any project we could think of, we could get somebody to greenlight because there was very few people doing what we were doing. And so Tanya and I sat down and was like, well, okay, I'm always saying I want to be the kind of person that like centers voices that don't normally get centered, because I have had all the privilege in the world. But as a singer, I don't get to do that very often. I don't have that many choices. I can say yes or no to a role, but I don't get to program which opera they do. And for a little while there, we got to decide what we did. And we made some really cool stuff with it that I'm very proud of.
So what's the future for Helio Arts? Is this something that's going to keep growing? Or is it sort of in like a good place now where it's like a conveyor belt and you're putting out all these new projects? Or what do you see as the future of this?
Yeah, I mean, I hope that, first of all, y'all should go watch stuff on it because there's a bunch of cool things, helioarts.com. But I hope that whether or not Helio is the place that is the center of this new kind of art form, I hope that it encourages artists to make more of that content and to think outside the box in terms of what classical arts can be. And yeah, I want to find more content for it, find a way to connect with more people to watch what's on there. And, connect with more artists who have something to say and just kind of encourage, especially singers, dancers, instrumentalists who are often sort of pigeonholed in a non-creative corner, right? It's like, you just do what we tell you to and do it really well. It's you might as well be a welder or something. But those people all have incredible ideas, and they're not always given the opportunity to express them. And I think this is a perfect place for that. And it's been really satisfying so far.
And, you keep mentioning how this is sort of like the first of its kind. Nobody else was doing this before. Why do you think that is? Why does the classical, and I kind of feel like I know the answer to this already, but why do you feel like the classical music, sphere doesn't adapt to innovative storytelling so well?
Yeah, I don't want to sell it too short, because there have been opera films in the past, sort of off and on. It's been sort of a novelty, and they were only for traditional operas, right? 200 or 300-year-old operas that everyone knows really well. I think a few things have come together to make it different now. One is just access to those things, right? There's streaming platforms like ours, but there's also YouTube, and there's, all these other places that you can access those arts. There's also, just as I was saying, with like the cameras, there's just almost anybody can do this now. Even with your iPhone, you can make amazing films with just an iPhone. And in the opera business, there has been a real shift really in the last couple of years, but also it's been ongoing for probably the last 10 or something, to put a lot more focus on new pieces. I think really unfortunate thing about the opera world is that for hundreds of years, we were only performing what was being written right now. And then somehow over the last 80 years, 100 years, we've decided, no, we've written all the opera that's important. Let's just do those ones over and over and over and over and over. And there's a bunch of new stuff being made that's really cool. There's really interesting new composers. There's stories to be told that weren't, especially when you talk about people of color and how, composers of color are just now getting a foothold in our art form, and stories about people of color or about women or conductors who are women or composers who are women. I mean, there's all of these different perspectives that I think are really needed and wonderful, and is kind of opening the door to a bunch of new innovation. One of which is kind of the digital arts avenue. And I really hope to see that take off even more.
And then the last thing I have to ask you about, because you're such a busy man, there's so many things that I wanted to ask you about. I'm glad I have time to ask about this, but you also do volunteer work with an organization called Search for Common Ground. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So Search for Common Ground is the largest peace building nonprofit in the world. I think that's the way I would say it. That's the way they say it. They have offices in, I think, over 30 countries. They are essentially the entire idea behind it. And now I'm paraphrasing, so you should go to their website to learn how that you're really supposed to say it. But is that when you bring all of the stakeholders to the table in a conflict, and you genuinely, this goes back to how I think about dealing with characters, you genuinely treat them like human beings, even if you think they have done the most horrible things, and learn what they need, you can find innovative solutions to solve huge problems without violence. So an example I love is that they, I want to say it was the Congo, and I might be wrong, where there was an army they were having a ton of problems with. The army was raping women as part of their tactics. And they, some of the sort of official channels wouldn't even talk to the generals of those armies because it was, obviously they were doing something atrocious. And Search sort of brought, as is their policy, brought everyone to the table who had a stake in the situation. And that included this general. And they learned through talking to him that he didn't want that to be happening, but he didn't know how to deal with it. And he needed to save face with his, superiors, to do it in a way that, didn't feel like some outside force was telling him what to do. So they brainstormed this way of putting this comic book together that they distributed to the soldiers, and did different sort of ways for them to communicate with each other, and ended up reducing the rate of rape super drastically, by 40% or something like that, in a very short amount of time. And they do stuff like that all over the world all the time. I'm mostly a cheerleader for them. I like to tell everyone about them. I do, we'll occasionally do a concert or something for them. I did do their field training for their officers, where we really did I think it was a 2-day or 3-day session where we had all of these real world problems thrown at us in teams and had to use their system to come up with innovative solutions. And that was sometimes, for example, relationships between police and people of color in a city situation, because that was a lot of what was going on at the time, still going on. And anyway, I think it's an amazing organization. They do incredible work all over the world, including here in the United States. And yeah, I think that way of solving problems is something that we are really missing right now in society and in this country specifically. And there is a lot of room for solutions without having to sacrifice your principles. And that's another big part of it is you can have a conversation with somebody who you think has made horrible choices. And you don't have to say that you agree with them to be able to treat them respectfully so that you can come up with a solution. And I really think that's an important way to move forward as our society, because we're really struggling with that right now.
Yeah. So I just want to slip 2 more questions in here. The last 2 questions you always end with. First is, if you had to boil all of what you've said down to one piece of advice that you'd give to creatives, what would it be?
Treat everyone as if they are a whole human being, including your characters and yourself.
I like that. And then last, but certainly not least, this is your time to promote. What do you have coming out? Where can people find you? And anything that you mention, I include in the show notes for the recording. So I'll have links to all of this. So mention whatever you want to mention. Yeah,
you can find me at ryanmckinney.com, Ryan McKinny at all the socials. I'm doing a recital in Lawrence, Kansas this coming weekend. I'll be in Seattle singing Marriage of Figaro starting in April. Please go check out helioarts.com, see all the awesome films that we have there, and follow them on all of the socials. And yeah, I think that's it.
Awesome. Well, Ryan, thank you so much. I understand now why they say you are an artist with something to say. You had so many great things to say here. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you. It was really great to talk to you, Josh.
And to all of our listeners, thank you for being here. We're off next week, but we'll be back the following week. Stay tuned for that, and we'll see you then. Bye-bye.